interesting. Nice.
Alright, so we're good to go. Thank you everybody for coming out. I'm here to introduce Eli Valley is an American Jewish writer and cartoonist, the former artist-in-residence at the Forward newspaper, and with his work featured in The Nation, The New Republic, The Village Voice, The Guardian, The Nib, The Daily Beast, and more. The recent publication of his collection of feverish drawings, Diaspora Boy, Comics on Crisis in America and Israel, has thrust him forward as one of the leading voices of the Jewish left. Los Angeles Review of Books called it one of the most fascinating and darkly humorous books in living memory. So, please welcome him.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and thanks for dealing with all this insanity the past week. Thank you for two students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace for having the courage to invite a Nazi to speak on campus. First of all, I realized, I already decided on the shirt, and I realized it's a brown shirt, so these shitheads are going to be like, oh, it's a brown shirt on campus. So you got to take it out of your mind. And, but no, in all, seriousness at the moment, thank you at SJP to Alexander Mackworth Mendoza and Zeta Blotner. Zeta, you here? Oh, hi, yeah. And at JVP, M. Wilder and Esther Zweig. And also Jacob Kupperman. Are you here?
No, they're at USC.
Sorry?
They wish they could be here. They're at USC. Okay,
I'm not thanking Jacob Kupperman. He's removed him from the video. I'm kidding. Thank him as well. He's very, very sweet and very kind, and I appreciate it. And the rest of SJP and JVP, they're a great bunch of decent people who are being pilloried and demonized by some pretty ugly forces. And thank you to security insofar as I have not been shot. Please, I wish actually there was a little more security, but whatever. My mom is skipping out as we speak. Before I begin the presentation, I need to address something for the sake of clarity, for the sake of honesty, and because I refuse to be gaslit. This past week has been a bit of an experience in which I've been smeared nonstop by forces allied with the intended extermination of our people. And I've been called an anti-Semite. It's almost too absurd even for my comics, or maybe it's not. But a world in which Meghan McCain is a Jew is a world in which Nazis can feign outrage over anti-Semitism. The funny thing is, my presentation is kind of about this stuff, so I don't really need to address it, and yet I am going to for about 3 hours. Here's one of the forces at the New York Times op-ed page Unleashed. Demonization of me as a Jew hater. I'm fine with disgruntled. I agree with that. But But look at the images they chose in the background. On the left is my ferocious condemnation of Trump's GOP for being the party of the KKK and American Nazis. On the right, my ferocious condemnation of Trump's GOP for being the party of the KKK and American Nazis. This is the essence of gaslighting. Anti-Semites calling Jewish criticism of Nazism, Nazism. Not to glorify myself, but this is why they hate me. Protesting the GOP's fusion with the forces of hatred, bigotry, and ethnic cleansing that led to the Holocaust. This is after the Pittsburgh pogrom, when we protested, me along with several other people, at the New York GOP club for having hosted a literal fascist just days before the pogrom in Pittsburgh. I want to talk about one more thing before I begin, if you don't mind. We are 2 years into the reign of a president who is the hero of American Nazism, who dehumanizes marginalized communities using the exact same language Hitler used about Jews, who slashes funding for agencies dedicated to researching and fighting the dominant form of terrorism in America, white supremacist terrorism, who pursues alliances with murderous fascists throughout the world, who has Nazi allies and white supremacists on his staff crafting his agenda, who implements policies of ethnic cleansing on the border, who methodically uses neo-Nazi dog whistles about Jews using brown people to replace the white race. Dog whistles that led to 2 anti-Semitic massacres in 6 months, including the most horrific pogrom in American Jewish history. Who a week after the second anti-Semitic massacre again signal boosted a white supremacist on social media, famous for that same great replacement theory. When we are in this crisis, for an organization to call itself Stanford College Republicans is already a pretty outrageous affront, I think. But it's fine, free speech even for Hitler Youth. For that to have brought an anti-Semitic Holocaust revisionist felon to campus is disgusting. And for them to bring a Jew for Jesus to push the Jewish erasure concept of Judeo-Christianity is gross. But for that organization to terrorize Jewish students with Nazi imagery in their dorms is unconscionable. This is an anti-Semitic hate group, and Stanford needs to treat it as such. And we know the Stanford Republicans were just looking for an excuse to spread Nazi propaganda and terrorize Jews, and not do it in their usual way, using anime avatars on storefront message boards. Because the image of mine they used as pretext was a drawing featuring joyous Jewish debate, a playful Jewish intra-communal in-joke about how we in the Jewish community love talking about our Judaism. Jews who are not coming at this with sleazy bad faith know what this is about. It was a drawing that was so appreciated by the Jewish community, if I may brag. It was on this tote bag, put out in 2012 by the National Jewish College Student Journalism Association. But to the alt-right, any portrayal of Jews is inherently repulsive, and therefore a good pretext to share images from Der Stern. So before we begin, I want to say this. The only way that they can survive is by gaslighting us. The only way they can survive is by lying about us. The only way they can survive is by demonizing us. And we must not let them. All right, now that we've gotten this out, let's wipe out the Nazis, hopefully in reality, but also from our minds. Wipe out the college Republicans, the alt-right, the anti-Semites pretending Jewish anti-Nazi art is Nazi art. Take it out so that we can enter the sacred space of comics. Shabbos is beginning soon. Let's pretend it's beginning now. Let's pretend this is a temple, this is our service, and let's begin this presentation at the beginning. All right? We happy now? Ready? The beginning, okay? In the beginning, in the year 70 of the Common Era, the Romans destroyed the Jerusalem temple, sending Jews into diaspora. In the year 1952 of the Common Era, Harvey Kurtzman and Will Elder created MAD. Everything that happened between those two dates is utterly insignificant. This evening, I'm going to take you on a tour through MAD, comics, Jewish comics, sermons for the 70s, sex toys, and self-hatred. Or I should clarify, what we've been told is self-hatred for generations. Because I'm also going to talk about real self-hatred. Genuine self-hatred. The most obscene self-hatred. The kind of self-hatred that is a danger not only to the Jewish community, but to entire populations both here in America and abroad. But because I don't want to talk so soon about Nazis, although I already did, I'm going to start off with this puppy pic. And I'm going to talk about my childhood. Actually, that is not my childhood, that is Google image search. Marching to free Soviet Jews, with a sign reading, Nazis kill the body, Soviets kill the soul. Can't escape these Nazis as a child or as an adult. Here's me in November 2016, fighting against Steve Bannon. Don't be a patsy, drop the Nazi. First of all, I want to note my amazing emotional progression in life. But also, I like the progression of my signs, you know? Nazis kill the body, it's a little bit trite, but don't be a patsy. I feel like that's punchy, so I'm proud of my poetic evolution since the age of 6. But I also want to talk about my childhood as sort of a frame for the comics and diaspora boy until today. But to back it up, my name is Eli, and I draw comics. But I didn't always draw comics. In fact, when I was little, I was a comics reader. And I wasn't just a comics reader, I was a comics reader who was the son of a rabbi. And that's kind of a kinetic combination, and I want to explain to you why. I was obsessed with a sense of escape that comics would provide me. For instance, when I was little, I would have all these fantasies while my father was giving the sermon. My sister and I were trapped in the first or second rows because we were the rabbi's kids. If we negotiated for like a week, we could sit in the third row, but generally it had to be right up in the front. One time during the sermon, my sister got up, headed towards the door to use the restroom. My dad called out from the bima, the pulpit, "Where are you going?" Because it was the greatest disrespect and shame for the rabbi's own kids to skip his sermon. If he couldn't keep his own family captive, the idea was, what good was he? So we were trapped, and I'd be retreating into this fantasy and having all these creative rushes, my mind be racing. And I'd be staring at the Chumash. By the way, I emphasize Chumash to give you, Jewish legitimacy, the same way that Ben Shapiro says Hamas when he's talking about Hamas. or to demonize, Anyway, I'd be mesmerized by that magnificent blue ribbon coming down the middle. I started fetishizing the ribbon. And I fantasized that the Super Friends were all on one side of the ribbon. Even Aquaman swimming over the Hebrew letters. By the way, it took me about 20 hours in Photoshop, so I appreciate some product. And the supervillains would be on the other side. They'd be having this battle royale on either side of a ribbon, all while my father was sermonizing about the imminent destruction of Israel and ways that we could extend our lives through vitamins. All pastors' kids understand what I'm talking about. Anyway, maybe this experience, let me take out my gum. Sorry. Maybe this experience, don't look at that, here. Terrifying sermons in my ears, not being able to pee, fantasizing superheroes in a duel to the death on a Bible, would come together in comics decades later like The Incredible Hulk. The Incredible Hulk is your average Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde treatment applied to a liberal Jew who becomes right-wing batshit insane on the solitary issue of Israel. He hears something that can be considered slightly, not entirely, 100% pro-Likud. The farmers cannot reach their olive groves, and that sets him off. No! Don't talk the whole comic here, but it's not a pretty scene. Destroying television anti-Semites, cutting funding for PBS, starting Facebook groups. Palestinians already have a state, Jordan, by the way. This didn't go, but there are like 25 groups like that probably. Anyway, this comic is from 11 years ago, but like a lot of this work, it slowly becomes more and more true as the years go by. As you can see, Hulk absorbing the values of people he perceives to be his only friends, evangelicals. Evangelical Christians, the only friends Hulk has. Jesus advocating expelling the Arabs and giving tax cuts to billionaires. Hulk fight against abortions. Hulk support creationism. Hulk deport homosexuals and Mexicans. Hulk put Jesus Christ on dollar bills. Anyway, then just as quickly as it began, the monster transforms back to human form. It feels as though a veil has lifted. I can think again. Bruce Banner spends his days pining for a time when the madness will end. Maybe I can still make that move on meetup, and he can return to a normal life without the beast that was always with him. The comic explored a phenomenon common to many American Jews, progressives on all issues except for when it comes to Israel-Palestine, especially during times of crisis. And that's one psychological cycle of being an American Jew who is involved and invested today, and who has at least a minimum capacity for self-reflection. Here are a couple of frames from the original Hulk from 1962 by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, The Incredible Hulk, or as the Stanford College Republicans call it, Der Stürmer. I use actual phrases from the original. It feels as though a veil has lifted, I can think again. Or brutal, bestial mockery of the human. But I took out worship's power, actually, because I thought it was too cliched of an attack on Israel. So, contrary to what is sometimes said about my work, I do actually exercise restraint. Anyway, the Hulk was taking an American hero and turning him into a paranoid, psychopathological, post-Holocaust, Israel-obsessed Jew. And I feel that's part of a distinct American Jewish heritage of not only inventing cultural icons, but inverting them. And it all goes back to Mad, these Mad comics of the 1950s. I take great cultural pride in Mad because it was created by New Yorkers, mostly Jewish, not to be all ethnocentric up in here, but I am, pretty proud culturally, especially Harvey Kurtzman and Will Eldred. They brought a cacophonous Yiddish theater sensibility to bear on 1950s American culture. I only discovered Mad through these reprint editions and once they were to become a magazine, and I did not understand the cultural references, but I knew that something revolutionary was going on, that it was putting a funhouse mirror up to the sacred icons of American culture. For instance, we're all familiar with Mickey Mouse here, right? We do know Mickey Mouse, right? Okay. With Mickey, everything was happy, right? Mad's version was Mickey Rodent, a totalitarian universe in which all the characters are forced to wear Verschlungener three-fingered gloves or face expulsion to detention centers. Here's Mickey spazzing out on Donald and the three little Nudnik ducks. They always throw in Yiddish, by the way. It was sort of like an in-joke, but also it's part of what would become American vernacular. To me, this showed the true colors of the Disneyfied, commodified culture of post-war America. Or Archie, America's typical teenager. You probably know him through Riverdale, right? They turn into Starchy, the violent drug addict. Here's Mr. Weatherby as alcoholic pervert. I don't know, is Mr. Weatherby in Riverdale? I'm not even sure. Yeah, well, he's the principal. Also, note the meta aspect. It's pretty revolutionary for its time. He's talking about how the way they're drawn is so attractive that it's driving him to alcohol. I know it's not very, it's a little problematic in the ensuing decades, but look here, the Betty's purse. You see the joints, the heroin needle, the pills, the trick cards, they're all Ace of the Hearts. And there's like little things they throw on the side, you know. Chicken fat is how Will Elder called it. This is the underbelly of Archie, or the underbelly of American mythology more broadly. And they even took on Santa Claus in a mad spin-off called Panic. Jews in the 1950s depicting Santa as a cursing, divorced, see the bumper sticker? Sexually experimental minstrel performer. That was a reference to a jazz singer. To me, this is Jewish outsider humor before Jews became part of the dominant American culture. And of course, outsider humor gets punished, as we learned this week. The Santa satire led to bannings and arrests. Barry Weiss wasn't around then, but her precursors were. And eventually, when it reached a peak, Congress stepped in, worried ostensibly about juvenile delinquency, and joined the war on the comics industry. The Comics Code, the self-regulating or self-neutering body, was introduced in 1954. And Mad survived only by becoming a magazine. And frankly, it was mostly the horror and violent titles that were also going around at the time that sunk the industry. But I like to think that it was Mad itself, with its revolutionary satirical fervor, pioneered by Kurtzman and Elder, attacking conformity in 1950s America and attacking the political presumptions that caused the anti-comics crusade. So a few years ago, I was thinking, if Mad is Jewish sensibility holding a funhouse mirror up to American culture, here's Howdy Doody, which they turn into this mercenary Howdy Do It, who threatens kids to get their parents to buy them stuff. Why is nobody putting a funhouse mirror up to Jewish culture today? Here's Ben Shapiro, the Jewish community's own Howdy Doody. Ben Shapiro has used the cover of Orthodox Judaism to espouse white supremacism, to demonize marginalized communities, and to gleefully incite terror throughout the world. I drew him at Seder, siding with the Egyptians, the alt-right of their time, and attacking the Israelites using the same language he's used to attack Muslim communities. Talking about their birth rates, as Ben has done, saying they were terrorists, saying they were a threat to Egyptian civilization. By the way, I love doing Seder comics, Passover comics in general, because I love Jewish narrative and tradition, but also because for generations now, people like Ben Shapiro have erased non-Orthodox Jews. Literally calling us Gino, Jews in name only, and insisting we weren't Jewish. Guess what? We are Jews, and we are not bad Jews. Not only is it our tradition, but narratives and rituals like the Passover Seder, focusing on liberating the oppressed and opposing empire, is far closer to Jewish left values than by anything spewed by a hateful, Jewish erasing white supremacist like Ben Shapiro. I just remembered something. I hope everyone could come in. Is everyone here? I mean, who could get in? Because the people on the list, I just realized they might be DMing. Are we cool? Everyone is in who wants to get in? All right, cool. Okay, cool. I hope it works. It just occurred to me. I'm like, I hope no one is like trying to get. Okay. Anyway, check out the kids at the Seder. I love my developing oeuvre of children's reaction shots to the shit they're doing. People say my comments are cynical. Actually, they're not, because I believe these kids, the future, will grow up and make a change. And ultimately, they're stand-ins for me. But anyway, back to the whole, larger issue of Mad. To me, it feels like a perfect match because there's so much to satirize, and also it brings it full circle, using the Mad aesthetic not to lampoon sacred Americana, but the sacred truths or assumptions of Jewish life, particularly Jewish political life. But back to my family tree. My parents got divorced around the time these photos were taken. You can see me already in the lower left here, already caving into an imaginary universe. By the way, I don't know who these people are, but it looks like something out of a 1970s Italian horror film. But it's not. They're just kids who want to spend their childhood marching in rallies. And this is how I grew up. My father was religious, but he lived about 100 miles away from us. Here he is with the cast of The Sopranos. And when we visit him, my sister and I would be observant, playing the role of the upright, uptight children of rabbis, getting molested by Disney characters. And playing doctor. And actually, I know that looks totally creepy and perverse, but the fact that I'm wearing a yarmulke proves that it's totally wholesome and legit. But then we go back to my mom, and my father would be in sort of a panic to legislate the religion from afar. Which isn't easy if you're a rabbi, especially when the focus of so many of your sermons is the fight against assimilation and intermarriage. he wasn't speaking in a vacuum either. Here's Look magazine from 1964, talking about how by the year 2000, Jews would comprise a tiny, tiny, tiny minority in America, as opposed to the tiny, tiny minority we were then. So I'd see my dad every 3 weeks, and I'd have this intensive Jewish communal experience. And then I'd go back to America at my mom's, but he'd still be there, a phone call away, urging me to avoid assimilation at all costs. It might make you wonder, it made me wonder, what would happen if Batman and Robin worked in the American Jewish community? Like the Hulk, Batman and Robin was my way of making superheroes Jewish. It's funny because there's a lot of books these days about how superheroes are metaphors for Judaism because they were created by Jews or they faced exile or they were minorities, but none of these accounts reflect the Jewish life or experience I grew up with. And that's one reason I drew Batman and Robin, or so many of my comics, to make space for my own Jewish narrative. So here's a little taste of Batman. In the Batcave. Batman, there's an emergency at Elm Elementary School. Actually, it should be a different voice because he's Robin, but whatever. To the Batmobile, Robin. Batman and Robin. Johnny Goldberg, do not sit down. Just in the nick of time, Batman. What's wrong? Is there a bomb? Worse, Johnny, are you aware that American Jews are on the verge of vanishing completely? Holy ethnic dissolution, Batman. Huh? If you sit with these Gentiles, you'll be taking the first steps towards destroying the Jewish people. Do you want Hitler to win, Johnny? You sit with Gentiles today, tomorrow you'll have sex with them. Then what, Johnny? Your kids will be bastards. It's actually not true. Technically, according to Halakha, Jewish law, they won't officially be bastards. Like at every presentation, there's like someone's like, and now they're going to take that, cut that out, and the alt-right is going to put it in a video. Ellie's an anti-Semite. Anyway, it goes on. I don't want to give spoilers, but hey, it's Aquaman. What are you doing here? I just finished building the world's first underwater Holocaust memorial. Excellent work, Aquaman. Now all the porpoises of the world shall know the tragedy that befell the Jews. Next issue, Batman and Robin campaign for Israel on campus. Anyway, Batman was pulled straight out of my childhood. My sister, God bless her, does not understand any of my comics. She has actually assimilated a bit more thoroughly than me. But when I did this one, she was like, oh my God, that was us. We were that kid, that was our childhood. And I want to emphasize this about my dad. It wasn't just this thorny, tortuous stuff. He was actually fun, too. You can see that in this letter that he wrote me in summer camp. He wrote it on a torn piece of paper, taking on the persona of supervillain, saying, in all caps, I am holding your father hostage. Same as the Batman voice, oddly. He is my prisoner. I torture him sometimes, but in general, his health is okay. I will release him on one condition, that you turn over all your comic books to me. So that's, funny and creative, a source of inspiration, you'd think, right? On the other hand, it involved my father being kidnapped by outside forces, Gentiles, no doubt, and asking me to save him through my comics. Had no effect on me at all. Anyway, a lot of this came to a head when I went to high school, and I hope you don't mind, but we are doing my entire life story tonight, so you're going to get out by, I think, Sunday morning. I decided to go to public school, and it caused a cataclysm between my father and me because he wanted me to take, because basically I went to a Jewish day school in South Jersey. The only one that continued into high school was in Philadelphia, so I needed to bus into Philly every day. Didn't want to do that. I held my ground, but there was a lot of tension, which is inevitable when your father names you Eliezer. I actually loved high school because it was my first taste of real diversity and therefore real America, but the fear was what my father would think. He wanted to know who my friends were and whether they were Jewish. In my yearbook, for instance, this was the breakdown. And then there was me. Actually, you know what? I think Holly was Jewish too, okay? So, anyway, I know it sounds ridiculous to be counting or even to care, but that's how I felt when my father would ask me ever so nonchalantly what people's last names were, what their mother's maiden names were, what town in Poland their grandparents came from. It made me feel like I was hiding, not so much from my classmates, but from my father, lest he know that I was assimilating. I felt just like Anne Frank. No, I didn't, and I'm doing this just so the alt-right assholes have more information, more material. But the reason for my father's panic was the concern that Jews were dying out. And you have to, understand his point of view here. We needed to recreate, in his view, what the Nazis had destroyed. I remember learning at a young age, too young of an age to be learning these things, that all my sperm was precious because it contained enough cells to make up for all the lives lost in the Shoah. I don't remember the science, it was per ejaculation or per weeks of masturbation or what, but you can imagine the pressure this put on. Not to mention the ways I started thinking about sex. Alt-right, college, Republicans, take your pictures now. I'm going to lose the slide, take your fucking pictures now, assholes. I admit that joke was funnier when there weren't Nazis on the march in America. But we'll get to that. Anyway, before we get to that, let's talk about my mom, because public psychotherapy is very healthy and also cheap. I never really understood or experienced the Jewish mother stereotype because my mom is nothing like it. In fact, if my father is both reverent and controlling, my mom was sort of the opposite. Visiting my father, these are the books I would see. Sermons for the 70s. Sermons the year round. Best Jewish sermons of 571. Personal favorite, actually. Best Jewish sermons of 5725 to 5726. Not such a good year for sermons, And coming back to my mom's, these are the books I would see. The Joy of Sex. Not on a high shelf either. Or the collected letters of Van Gogh. My father would give me gifts like this. My mom would give me gifts like this. Dildo, apparently, from a trip to Jamaica. Thank you, Mom. Anyway, back to my family tree. Here's my dad standing Dirty Harry style in front of his synagogue defaced by a swastika. Here's my mom after feeding us peyote, teaching us kumbaya. But my mom was not always like that. While they were married, they were both balei tshuva, which is a Jewish term. Are there actual Jews here, or do they all do counter-programming down the street? Something I actually heard, which is very offensive to me, to be honest. But are there people who know what balei tshuva means? Thank you. Okay, cool. It means borderline psychotic. But no, officially it means master of return, because the Orthodox own the terminology of authenticity, so master of return means born-again Jew, essentially. So they're born-again Jews. They became more religiously observant. Here she is, in the lower left, in the synagogue sisterhood brunch, the rebbitzin in the newspaper, next to Mary Tyler Moore, it would seem. The difference is, though, my father stayed with it, my mom didn't, partly because being a rabbi's wife was too constraining. Of course, the irony or paradox is the obsession with continuity destroyed the marriage. But whatever, I'm over it. I don't pity myself. I don't Photoshop my parents into old magazines because that would be a sign of mental illness. Anyway, when Mom left, she left it all and apparently became a government spy. And after the divorce, they went their separate ways. My dad continued his religious life. Here he is organizing services on the Long Island Railroad. Not a joke, actually, it's real. No joke. And my mom became a social worker working with underprivileged kids in Albany, New York. Yeah, that's her in the middle there. So in some ways, I was caught between the two, with two very different backgrounds competing for my attention, and if you don't mind the melodrama, my soul. You can see my mom was really happy at this family reunion. But ultimately, if I had to choose between going to services on the Long Island Railroad and playing hopscotch in Albany, I am going to go with the latter. And yet, this is something that the ardent defenders of the faith don't seem to understand. It is still my culture, and I'm still fascinated by it and fixated on it. It is a great reservoir of narrative and artistic inspiration, and I refuse to let it be defined by the schmucks. I want to add, it's not just that my mom became religiously non-observant, or stopped being religiously observant, she also brought me up with a certain unique perspective. You can see that in the letter that she wrote me, the same year that my dad wrote me that supervillain letter, and the same year that that photograph was taken. It was my bar mitzvah, actually, that photograph. After telling me she was going to have the summer camp torture me and give me a Mr. T haircut, she signed off with this. The 4th of July is approaching, a time when we must remember the struggles that our forefathers endured to establish on this continent a nation independent of the Queen and King of England, which land was to subsequently become a far greater threat to and violator of human rights both here and abroad than the parental England ever was. However, we must perform our patriotic role and light a spark. I know you will carry on the family tradition and fart on the flag. So it should be no surprise that I identified so strongly with MAD when I first discovered it. I want to mention, of course, my mom's a little older now, a little bit more sedate, so these days, instead of having me fart on the flag, she has me Skype with her cat. Yeah, but there is still a revolutionary impulse to both, I think. Anyway, if I'm fascinated by and fixated on the Jewish stuff, the question becomes, am I going to go my father's route and draw it as adorable kittens singing the Israeli national anthem? Or am I going to go my mother's route and draw it as violent chimpanzees warring for tribal territory? Or to put it another way, this or this? And of course it is the latter, it's kind of a rhetorical question. Is it really self-hatred or is it actually Jewish cultural pride? I'm going to go with the Jewish cultural pride. By the way, I don't know if you saw this tweet from San Francisco Jewish whatever newspaper. Literally it said, is Eli Valley a voice of Jewish left, or is he a disgusting, repulsive, anti-Semitic slug? It's like, well, gosh, it's a quandary. How do we Anyway. comics in Diaspora Boy and afterwards are an articulation of Jewish pride. But because they express pride in non-Zionist and secular terms, they've been dismissed as the opposite of proud. In fact, the most ardent and vocal defenders of the faith have branded them as self-hated. Why is Jewish pride called self-hatred? Why is a drawing that embodies a love for Jewish culture, conversation, and community, so much so, as I said, and I will say again, that it was used on a tote bag for Jewish, be compared to Nazi terrorist imagery by a campus alt-right organization? Why are Jews who stand with an anti-Nazi activist like Linda Sarsour termed self-haters who should be barred from inclusion in the Jewish communal tent? Whereas Jews who elevate and celebrate actual Nazis are considered the embodiment of authenticity and pride. That's Mort Klein, the head of the Zionist Organization of America, with Sebastian Gorka, Nazi ally. How did we enter this topsy-turvy universe in which some of the country's most prominent Jewish activists gave a standing ovation to the hero of American Nazism and the KKK? That's the reception Trump received at AIPAC's annual conference in 2016. Let me give a little context. We're at the tail end of a culture war that's defined Jewish authenticity for a century. Because when Zionists emerged on the scene over 100 years ago, they weren't just aiming to create a state. They were trying to refashion the very image and essence of the Jew. After centuries of anti-Semitic imagery, they were going to turn the tides and create a new Jewish prototype of farmers and fighters. Oh, I'm sorry, that's North Korean poster. I'm sorry. Anyway, the images are actually amazing. This is from an advertisement for a Teuton machine, literally a Teuton machine in 1908 that promised to turn Jews into Teutons. By the way, there's 18 men pictured, but there's one woman on the lower left, so you know Zionism is a progressive movement. I want to mention also that a lot of this is wrapped up in notions of masculinity and, of course, toxic masculinity. As you can see in this, not the toxic part necessarily, but the Zionist Gymnastics Journal from 1904. The idea was Zionism would create new generations of strong, agrarian, revolutionary, mustachioed Jews. But it's not limited to male imagery. Zionism produces super women too. In 1970 in America, Playboy ran a spread called The Girls of Israel, talking about, if I may quote, the superbly feminine beauties who grace this land of milk and honeys. Literally, these are quotes. And it says, the Israeli girl today is a totally new kind of woman, one still in the process of being created, almost without any ties to her past. As if that's a good thing. And I want to know it's not just Playboy in the 70s. Gal Gadot had an American breakthrough in 2007 when Maxim magazine ran a photo spread on women of the Israeli Defense Forces, featuring Gal Gadot saying, I'm not going to do it, but I will read what she said. I taught gymnastics and calisthenics. The soldiers loved me because I made them fit. Another time I will do the Israeli accent. It might have been too racy for the old Zionist gymnastics journals, but the Israeli consulate saw it as a perfect emblem of the country, celebrating it at a New York club. Anyway, before we go on, it's extremely hot, as you can probably tell from me dripping so much. I'm going to short circuit my computer. Is it possible to add any kind of ventilation or air here? Are you guys hot too, or is it just the meat of the subject matter? Thank you, I appreciate it. Thank you.
There's a fan right there.
Make sure the the shooters are unable to get a clear shot. All right, thank you. Anyway, early Zionists didn't simply envision the reborn Jew they were striving to become. They also depicted the contemporary diaspora Jew in a physical and emotional state that they were trying to leave behind. And in so doing, they reinforced a lot of anti-Semitic ideology. Here are some lithographs by the Art Nouveau Zionist artist Ephraim Moshe Lilien, which depicted diaspora Jews as covered in barbed wire, suffering in a metaphorical Egypt, and sinking on a boat next to the literal embodiment of death. Zionism is a very subtle movement, you have to understand. Here's one of his drawings reproduced on a postage stamp in Israel. And honestly, this Nazi image of Aryans versus Jews could have been used with little alteration in an early Zionist pamphlet about the new Jew versus the diaspora Jew that he was sent to replace. To this day, Zionist thought needs its foil. And the foil is not the Palestinian, I would argue. The foil is the Jew. This is where it gets preachy, I know, but I have to admit, I am my father's son, and those books had an effect on me. Anyway, I drew this thanks for the air, by the way. That's helpful. So I drew this comic, Israel Man and Diaspora Boy, basically illustrating the stuff I learned in Hebrew day school, summer camp, trips to Israel, and experiences with emissaries in America and Europe. Since I know there's some Hebrew speakers, I'm going to say this. True story, for the first 15 years of my life, I was convinced the word shaliach was Hebrew for douchebag. Right? No, it's just because they kept telling me that my life was insufficient if I didn't move to Israel, and the whole purpose of meeting with these shaliachim, it literally means messenger. They were emissaries from Israel who were trying to get people to ultimately make aliyah, which means raise your soul to the higher level, meaning move to Israel. I mean, it literally means go up. The comic is a satire of a century of hatred, what I would call genuine self-hatred, by the architects and ideologues of Jewish national rebirth. That quote, "He is ridiculous and hateful to all men of high standards," is not from Mein Kampf. It's how Max Nordau, one of the founders of Zionism, referred to diaspora Jews. And it did not stop with the establishment of Israel. Whether it's intellectuals, Israeli writer, Jews in France are partial Jews. By the way, I love the ad on top, plant a tree for only $18. You're a partial Jew, but please plant a full tree. Or government ministers, Israeli Justice Minister, assimilation of diaspora Jews fulfills Hitler's mission, or vision, sorry. Or the Prime Minister, no future for diaspora Jewry. Or state-run ads urging Israelis to save Jews in the diaspora from being lost through intermarriage. Or state-financed propaganda outfits bifurcating Jewish history between death camp despair and military conquest. It's different than the old lithographs, but it's the exact same theme. I still remember visiting the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv, Israel's national edifice dedicated to chronicling the way you and I live if we are Jews who don't live in Israel. I actually love the Diaspora Museum because it's the saddest museum in the world. Look at these poor, miserable synagogue goers, these colorless corpses at prayer. True story, in Prague, during the Holocaust, the Nazis had intended to create a museum of an extinct race. In Tel Aviv, the Israelis succeeded. There are over 100 figurines in the exhibits there, not a single one is smiling. That's diaspora. The term Kafka gets overused, especially by me, but Jesus Christ, this is diaspora as a hallucinatory nightmare prison theme park. By the way, it's not supposed to be a concentration camp, it's supposed to be a Jewish market square. Hi, Franz. If only Israel existed, our lives would have sunlight and color. Also, I love the Jews of World Renown exhibit, empty. Full disclosure, it was probably an electrical malfunction, but I don't care. I'm a polemicist and I will take what I need. My favorite, actually, the wedding display. Sweetheart, you're getting married today, but you live in the diaspora, so put on your miserable face. Even the violinist is crying. And also, sometime in the last few years, they finally got rid of these displays, but thankfully I'd already come out with about 500 photographs. But here's a very important thing. If you take a trip from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and go to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial and Museum, but mostly memorial, you'll find a model of Auschwitz, from the changing area to the gas chambers to the crematorium, using the same style, the same colorless, tragic bodies that we saw in the Diaspora Museum. Now, it's understandable in Yad Vashem because it's mimicking the Nazi campaign of dehumanization, but it's not understandable in a Diaspora Museum unless you understand Zionism. When people talk about self-hatred, this is government-sponsored self-hatred created to sustain a national mythology. All I do is illustrate that mythology taken to the extreme. And when we in the diaspora buy into this, when a community dominated by non-Orthodox, not particularly nationalist members grants Orthodoxy and Zionism the role of the truest expressions of Judaism, we adopt a cultural identity of self-negation and self-loathing. Which brings us to the present moment and why I think Diaspora Boy has added urgency. The comics in my book chronicle a decade in which claims of self-hatred were used to marginalize the culture, values, and politics of the American Jewish majority. As Israel embraced a demagogue who's waged war not only on marginalized communities, but on the institutions of democracy itself. Like Trump, anathema to American Jewish values. We had this test and we failed it. Back to rallies. I found another rally photo from 10 years ago. That's me with a sign I drew of Abe Foxman, then the head of the Anti-Defamation League, rallying outside the 92nd Street Y in New York when Foxman was speaking. By the way, it wasn't just some random psychopath in the street, I was actually with some people. It was an organized rally against Foxman because he positioned the ADL against a congressional resolution recognizing the fact of the Armenian genocide. Now that's progression. From imaginary Nazis to actual Nazis, and then what in between? word choices, the term genocide. And I know it sounds bougie when sandwiched by Nazis to be arguing about words, but the reason for Foxman's genocide denial was Israel's relationship with Turkey. And it was in those years, the years chronicled in Diaspora Boy, that our community was twisting its values so much that it lost the ability to recognize genocide. So we shouldn't be surprised by where we are now. Here's a more recent example of the twist. In 2015, when Netanyahu coasted to victory, re-election victory, by spewing bigoted hatred against Palestinians, the average American Jew was mortified. Even the Obama administration, which had by then given up trying to influence Israel's off-the-brink extremist government, was shocked and put out a couple statements of criticism, divisive rhetoric. But American Jewish leadership, from the ADL to the American Jewish Committee to AIPAC, put out the most horrified statements condemning not Netanyahu's bigotry, but the Obama administration for having the chutzpah to criticize a would-be autocrat. But normalization of Netanyahu is only one piece of the machinery that helped bring us here. Because we've learned that Diaspora Boy must defer to Israel Man in all arenas, even at the expense of our very existence. As Trump offers neo-Nazis muted criticism, Netanyahu is largely silent. Because you can't go much further in the satirical universe of my comics than Israel Man normalizing Nazism in the diaspora. Israeli minister, preserving ties with Trump, bigger priority than denouncing neo-Nazis. What's happening today is a belated punchline to Israel Man and Diaspora Boy. This is a more recent comic, but in all my comics about the contempt of Zionists for American Jews or diaspora Jews more broadly, I never use Nazi imagery because it seemed too outlandish even for satire. But as is often the case with this work, satire has been eclipsed by reality. Here's the Zionist Organization of America again. Nazi normalizers friends of Israel, not anti-Semites. This was just after the election when Bannon was brought on as chief strategist. Pro-Israel groups avoid denouncing Bannon. But it wasn't just right-wing groups. Here's the Jewish Federation, supposedly representing all of us, on Bannon. Trump needs to be given an opportunity to lead with neo-Nazis. Quickly, we learned the rules of engagement. If you support human rights in Israel-Palestine, and/or if you liken the situation in the West Bank to apartheid, it's fair game to call you a Nazi, as our current ambassador to Israel called the majority of American Jews. And got a lovely mazel tov from AIPAC when he was appointed. But if you're an actual Nazi sympathizer, you're kosher, as long as your Islamophobia exceeds your Jew hatred and you support an expansionist Israel. Again, that's the head of the Zionist Organization of America celebrating Gorka. If we ever make Yad Vashem Part 2, this photo will be in the entrance. Here he is with an op-ed. We have to be clear, these leaders are endangering not only Palestinians and not only marginalized communities, they're endangering us. And we let them because we bought into the Diaspora Boy paradigm. Meanwhile, the head of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs warned local affiliates not to call for the firing of white supremacists and Nazi sympathizers because wealthy donors, Israel hawks, would be angry. They were concerned Jews would be angry Nazis were fired. Look at this, Nazi condemns Jews for betraying Israel. That's the end of satire right there. Or is this the end of satire? Netanyahu's son posts classic anti-Semitic meme drawing praise from neo-Nazis. Or is this the end of satire? White supremacist, white nationalist Richard Spencer gives Israel as an example of ethno-state he aspires to in the US. We become so accustomed to equating anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel that we are unable to see the real deal when it takes over the country. And we spent so many years allying with the most dangerous flames of fascism in Israel, and we've ostracized members of our own community who have tried to douse those flames, that we've been caught completely off guard to see the flames start to burn down our own homes. The ultimate irony, or end of satire, is this. The movements that corner the market on Jewish authenticity and Jewish pride are now allied with movements determined to exterminate Jews. What do we do with the fact that while the vast majority of American Jews feel the heartstrings of Jewish memory, history, and conscience when a white supremacist demagogue takes power, but two sectors, modern-day Orthodoxy and modern-day Zionists, have more than any other Jewish movement celebrated the prospect of ethnic cleansing fascism in America? How can we react when, after the greatest pogrom in American Jewish history, a pogrom directly inspired by Trump's nonstop vilification of refugees and their supposed financier intending to replace the white race, Israel can send over minister after minister to give cover to the white supremacist horror that Trump has spearheaded? This right here is the end of satire. after Pittsburgh shooting, Bennett not sure there's surge of US anti-Semitism. That's Israel's ridiculously named Diaspora Affairs Minister, providing the mind-bending punchline to this dystopian horror comedy. The most horrific pogrom in American Jewish history is trivialized and dismissed because the hero of American Nazism has given carte blanche to apartheid in Israel. Our very eradication is an acceptable price to pay. After the second anti-Semitic massacre in 6 months by a second man parroting Trump's invective about brown immigrants and refugees, finally there was an uproar against a Portuguese cartoon published in international editions of the New York Times, which had absolutely nothing to do with the massacre, incited by the Republican Party. The Jewish right and the right in general could not condemn the rise of Nazism, because that would mean looking in the mirror and taking responsibility for what they had helped normalize. So they responded to a white supremacist killing spree by pointing fingers elsewhere in one of the most obscene betrayals of morality in recent memory. And I want to emphasize, it's easy to have clarity after Charlottesville. There's no ambiguity to men shouting, "Jews will not replace us." Charlottesville made the, sorry, this is all the Stanford College Republicans, I'm repeating images here, sorry. Charlottesville made the subtext the text. But we knew who Trump was, and we knew what he was doing long before he entered the presidential race. The fact that white Jews were not on his immediate target list was no excuse for silence on an individual or an organizational level. This is from a post-election comment, when in my view Nazi analogies are mandatory, publishing lists of crimes like the Nazis. Here are Muslim refugees fleeing the US for Canada, not satire, actually happening today. Or a woman being dragged off by ICE. Hush, sweetheart, and be careful with your analogies lest you cheapen the sanctity of the Shoah. Just to be clear, if our history and collective memory is used only as blinders when similar horrors start befalling other people, then our history is worthless. By the way, I think on some level the Jewish right knows that they fucked up, even if they'll never admit it. All these never-Trumpers who were boosting Netanyahu for a full decade when Netanyahu was a mini-Trump. And I know this because I have a comics email list, a dreaded list if you're on it, but at one point I did the unthinkable. I added a bunch of Jewish right-wingers to the email list because I wanted to share my work with them and because someone had inadvertently CC'd when they meant to BCC and I got all these names. They never replied, and I assume they filtered me into non-existence, which I would too, honestly, until now, until post-election comics regarding what is happening. That's when suddenly they asked to be removed from the list. This, for instance, that's Mort Klein again, and the head of the Republican Jewish Coalition, both of whom had gone after Keith Ellison while supporting Donald Trump. So I had them giving Ku Klux Klan handjobs. And suddenly, I'm getting replies. Marty Peretz, get me the fuck off your phone. Second of all, this is the same Marty Peretz who said Muslim life is cheap and who propped up notorious serial sexual harasser Leon Wieseltier at the New Republic. But it was my email list that was found. Or this comic just after the election, which I think is extremely relevant to this day, featuring Sheldon Adelson, who had donated millions to Trump's campaign, knowing how vile he is. Sheldon Adelson in The Art of the Deal. So it's agreed, we exterminate the Jews here and you can exterminate the Palestinians there. Sign me up. Brett Stevens. Got a text. And then me, because I'm an asshole, I play dumb. Horrifying, in fact. We are living in I'm glad the comics serve you. I hope you'll do whatever you can to avoid that. And then, because it's Brett Stevens, possibly the dumbest columnist in America, he didn't understand. You don't get it. Then he went on, nobody wants to exterminate the Palestinians. Depicting Sheldon Adelson the way Der Stürmer used to caricature evil Jews is wretched, whatever you think of the man or his politics. You need to take a hard look at yourself and your easy assumptions. Okay? I replied, Brett, I was kidding. I know you don't like this sort of satire, although it's possible you don't understand any sort of satire. And I know you reflexively equate dissent from Likud extremism with anti-Semitism. And then, because I'm not extremely mature, not proud of this, I threw his last line back at him. You need to take a hard look at yourself and your agenda. No reply. Or this comic depicting Jared Kushner as a Nazi. Daddy, Daddy, don't you love my uniform? After this came out, Alan Dershowitz, who has been defending Trump and even advising him on his Muslim ban, thought this was disgusting. Yeah, I know. Mr. Epstein's plane thought this was disgusting. Anyway, he said please, so I appreciated the politeness. And I tried to be gracious, I actually sorry. But then he replied with this: Nazi symbols should be reserved for Nazis and not for the grandson of Holocaust survivors, which I found odd because Dershowitz himself had compared Richard Goldstone to Joseph Mengele after Goldstone chronicled Israel's and Hamas's war crimes in the Gaza War of 2009. Anyway, my point here is I'm not a Freudian, but I think it shows that they've realized on some level after the election that having insisted on blind allegiance to Israel's demagogues might have helped lead our community here. Also, this happened a year or two ago, but the reaction has been so furious, especially in the past week, that I've seen based on the smear campaign, to a Jew using Jewish memory and conscience to scream about what is happening, that I feel like there's something going on, if you will, to quote our president. Trying to silence a Jew raising alarm bells about history repeating and calling that anti-Semitism, things are getting uglier, and because I'm in the midst of it, it's hard for me to sort of know, like to make any kind of like conclusion about what's going on, but it's getting uglier. That's all I want to say at the moment. And I want to emphasize, even after Charlottesville, even after Pittsburgh, and even after Poway, Jews are not on the verge of losing our rights. The debate around opposing a bigoted demagogue should not start and end with, will that bigoted demagogue round up my own family? We're in a state of emergency in America, but we're also in a state of emergency as Jews. The silencing of diaspora Jews, or more precisely, the silencing of a secular, non-nationalist majority, has helped pave the way to today. And it's why so many of our organizations have been inert, complicit, or grappling for how to respond. I'm going to end the presentation with this comic from my book from 2015, We Thought We Were Free. It's when Netanyahu made his end run around Obama to deliver an address to Congress to try to scuttle diplomacy with Iran. American Jews were largely mortified by this. Netanyahu claimed to represent all Jews. He did not represent most of us. We thought we were safe here. We knew it. Land of the free. It resonated. In this country, we could be ourselves, and we could build lives without looking over our shoulders. Ethnic intolerance, racial prejudice, nationalist hysteria, we faced it all wherever we lived, but not here, not anymore. It couldn't happen here. But just when we got uncomfortable, we learned an ugliness headed our way. The government opening its doors to the very incitement we thought was a thing of the past. We had thought we were safe, free from xenophobia, free from demagoguery, but we'd taken it all for granted. On that day, we knew, no matter how safe we think we are, we might never really be free. At the end, it's not a homegrown American demagogue, but Netanyahu on the television. The twist of the comic is that the danger to diaspora Jews is not diaspora, but the leader from Zion who claims to speak in our name, despite representing all the forces we've come to abhor in our modern experience. But substitute Netanyahu for Trump, and it's no longer satire, it is literal. It is what we're experiencing now. But we knew this was coming, we laid the foundation, we deferred to our demagogues because diaspora boy must not speak out. But it's time to speak out. It's time to stop allowing people who have leapt into bed with Nazis to define Jewish authenticity and pretend to speak for us. It's time to recognize the diaspora experience as the cornerstone of our Jewish lives. And it's time to excommunicate the fascists. This book and my comics are, in my opinion, a new articulation of Jewish pride, away from Zionist self-hatred, away from Netanyahu, and away from Trump. And I hope they begin to help us begin to chart a path away from the current nightmare. Thank you.
Now we're going to have a little moderated Q&A section, so if you'd like to raise your hands if you have a question or comment, and yeah, we'll get around this. I don't know, Jordy, what we're doing mic?
No mic.
No mic. Okay.
Oh, cool, no questions.
Do you want to put up the art while they're done?
Oh, sure, yeah, Jordy.
This is my book. The art, they made some beautiful giant reproductions of my art that they're, during the exhibition part of the evening that it's going to be putting up. But yeah, do you have any questions on here? You got one?
Yeah. What was your immediate reaction to Megan McCain claiming that she was Jewish?
That she was Jewish, or that my cartoon was anti-Semitic?
Well, like that she found the fact.
My immediate reaction was really not surprised, because I've been called a self-hating Jew and an anti-Semite for a decade now by right-wing Jews, and so I just take it in stride. It was other people who were like, "Oh, it's so weird that a Gentile woman is calling a Jew an anti-Semite at her," And it didn't even strike me, because I've just been so inured to this shit. until afterwards, and it's like, oh yeah, I guess it is more absurd than I've become so acclimated to, Yes.
What do you think can be done about the media gap that's created itself over the last 5 or 10 years?
Media gap?
Media gap, wherein like left perspectives are being pretty effectively drowned out in proportionality, especially on YouTube and other elements of society as well.
Yeah, I wish I knew, invite me to campuses, be the other person, I don't know. I'm not a algorithmic genius, so I can't say why YouTube favors white supremacist videos over everything else, even if you're looking into, find out how to clip your cat's nails. It's like, oh, here's Ben Shapiro talking about how Muslims are too numerous in the West. How the fuck did that happen? But you need to ask them that. Sorry, I wish I had more of an answer, but it's,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Could you maybe say a little bit about what experiences you've had talking with your own family members about or engaging about these things, especially older generations or people who are just aren't on board yet?
I mean, I don't have, all my answers are going to be like copping out. I don't think it's worth engaging with someone. I mean, I draw comics instead, so I don't have to engage with them. So if you can draw or music or something, if you're going to have to engage, I mean, I actually like doing comics. One of the reasons I like doing for Passover is not just to, claim ownership of my own tradition and culture and narrative, but also to provide ammunition to people like satyrs who are listening to someone amplify Ben Shapiro bullshit, in their reading of the Haggadah, and be like, excuse me, what about this one, So, it's very hard because people, everyone's coming at it from very rigid polarization. Obviously, our side is correct, but it's difficult because you're always going to get an impasse. It's hard to imagine you'll be able to convince somebody who says Palestinians are not a people, they are not a culture, right? What can you even say to that? Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was awesome. How do you resist the gaslighting?
How do I resist it?
Yeah.
What do you mean resist it?
Like not internalize the gaslighting.
I appreciate that you think that I have not internalized it. And no, it's been difficult. It's been actually alarming. I mean, it's weird. I guess I've gotten shit from people, as I said, for a decade for not towing a Zionist line, but I've never gotten this kind of like don't let him speak, silence him because he hates Jews, by people who are allied with fucking Nazis. That has been like so astonishing to me, and also to have it amplified by the New York Times op-ed page was reprehensible and unconscionable. And there will be zero repercussions there. Just like there seems to be zero repercussions for the Stanford College Republicans distributing your Sturmer imagery in freshman dorms. So I don't know what to say. It's a developing situation. Yeah?
So how did you come to believe what you currently believe about Israel, Palestine, and Zionism? Was it all, how was your opinion, what were your opinions like earlier, and how did they shift?
And how they shift? It's interesting, I never used the term Zionist, but I think if I had to look back at my life, I would say that I internalized or just like sort of, believed Zionist presumptions throughout my childhood and adolescence, for sure. Even into some of my early comics, I think it was definitely, they were just like implicitly taking Zionist narratives at face value. I think the murder of Rabin affected me deeply. The murder that we need to always remember, incited partly by Netanyahu going to rallies in which there were targets on Rabin's head compared to a Nazi, and coffins, things like that. Just grotesque shit. It's still unbelievable that Netanyahu was allowed into any Jewish community building, and then I get this kind of shit happening to me. Anyway, so that was one thing. Another thing was spending some time in Israel and experiencing things myself. Going to Shabbat dinners in Kiruv, meaning Jewish outreach institutions or whatnot, and hearing the patriarch of a family singing songs about how Arabs are dogs, things like that. I'm like, wait, this is the authentic tradition that you're trying to get me into? I don't really, I don't get that. So things like that, and also working, a bit, intersecting with the Jewish community, and seeing the Zionist narrative and being the only one that is allowed, and all alternate viewpoints not only being like pushed aside and delegitimized, but like, identified with anti-Semitism when, it's like the very people who claim to want to be expanding the Jewish community's strength are actually weakening it by insisting on a monolithic line that repels, especially younger people's ideas and visions of human rights. Is that all right? Yes?
What do you think the best way is for you to approach liberal Jews who have a blind spot when it comes to Israel? Not the Ben Shapiro's, but
What do you mean by blind spot?
just they don't have any issues with Netanyahu or AIPAC, or they're constantly defending Netanyahu, but they wouldn't do that for any other country. Not the Ben Shapiro's, but the Democrats.
Yeah, I just want to know, are you talking about younger people or just in general?
Just in general.
Again,
I find it really frustrating.
yeah, I know. I find it frustrating too, and I always think it's interesting when I do this kind of presentation, which is definitely polemical, and obviously I have a point of view. People ask me questions like, "Oh, how can we, convince?" And it's like, I don't know. But also, I like when people are like, "Why aren't your comics?" And I'm not saying you're saying this, but people have asked me, "Why aren't your comics, offer a convincing argument to the other side to get them on your side?" I'm like, why? I mean. And also I do want to say that for decades now, the American Jewish community, our institutions, has talked about something called Klal Yisrael, meaning Jewish peoplehood, and that when we're dealing with increasing apartheid, what we should do is have two people on stage talking about our own struggles with Zionism and that kind of thing. I actually, I took it at face value for years until suddenly, at a certain point, I was like, fuck this, why do we keep doing this? All it is doing is blinding us to what's happening. So I don't really believe in that kind of détente anymore. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk. I'm just saying that, unfortunately, Jewish communal institutions within America have used talking, and certainly the peace industrial process, like Dennis Ross and all those people, have used this, as not necessarily deliberately, but as a sort of an avenue to avoid the increasing horror show that is happening on the ground. Yes?
Hi. So I think, as we've seen, anyone who understands your work understands that it's not anti-Semitic. I think you mentioned earlier that before the election you had a red line around Nazi, Jews and Nazi imagery, for example.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what are some of the other boundaries that you, as a Jewish artist, depicting Jews, often in grotesque situations, don't cross?
Well, honestly, I actually go out of my way to draw noses as small as possible, so that they can't with that shit. Doesn't matter. I can draw a minuscule nose, you need a magnifying glass for it, and they'll say, "Oh, this is your Sturmer," Everyone I draw is grotesque. It's the way I draw. But also, I also thought that when Trump became president, or even when I was drawing him when he was running for president, I was drawing him in the most obscene way beyond how I draw Netanyahu actually. So I'm like, finally, people will see this is my drawing style. It's not targeting Jews in terms of a visual narrative, or iconography or whatever. And that didn't happen. Instead, now, as we saw in the early slides, they're saying that my images of Trump are anti-Semitic, So there is no winning with assholes. There's no winning with assholes. But I would need to think more about red lines. Yes, there are red lines. I mean, the general red line is you don't shit on the powerless. You don't attack the people who are, lacking in, resources, power, etc. That's like a general thing. Although, it's a difficult argument because everyone thinks they're powerless. You can have Mark Zuckerberg will be like, "This really makes me feel like I'm in danger," or something like that. so finding an objective reality about who is in power and who is not can be a bit contentious sometimes. But that's one kind of general rule. Sorry if I can't think of. Sometimes I think of this and then I forget. So maybe it'll come to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's pretty well known that David Duke endorsed your work. He's the ex-Grand Wizard.
Wait, excuse me. What do you mean David Duke endorsed my work?
This is pretty well known.
Yeah, I know. He once said to me that Eli Valley, or not said to me, he published in his white supremacist thing, Eli Valley is saying things about Jews that no one else can say. He also has said things, he has quoted Haaretz, quoted Forward, quoted the Jewish Week. The fact that David Duke, the fact that a scumbag Nazi is going to point to something that I've done is no reason to not have Jewish communal dialogue and self-criticism, etc. And I know what you're doing. If you're not being malicious now, my apologies. but I feel like I've heard this shit before. What the implication here is that we should close down all Jewish newspapers and we should anesthetize our culture so that the scumbag pieces of shit can't use it against us and make us look bad. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, I guess the question kind of answered itself, but I was wondering, like, what are your interactions like usually with right-wing Jews and right-wingers in public who are sort of aware of your work? Because there's all this invective, well, I said, but, you know, there's all this invective sort of directed at you online, like, you know, like, you know what I'm talking about. But I'm wondering, like, do you ever encounter them? What is that? What are those conversations like?
You know, it's hard because that's a broad generalization. So there are some people I know who were friendly. I don't know, we used to be friendly. I don't know if we're still as friendly. It's like it's decreasingly an option to be friendly. But you know, there are the people who I only know online. Yeah, like I wonder if like some of these people, like, you know, I think Abe Foxman once came to a thing I did not identify himself, and I'm like, well, that is definitely him. It was at the Center for Jewish History in New York, and you know, it would have been interesting actually talking to him. But I would need like specific examples. Like if it's someone that I pilloried in my comics, it's not going to be a good situation, you know. But if it's just someone that like we disagree online or something, and they're not rancid and toxic, I'd be happy to have a conversation. You know, I mean, it's the kind of thing that it's a good thing to have conversations, but it really depends on the personality. You know, if they're malignant, it's not going to be a good situation. Yeah.
My question to you is pretty basic. How do you define Zionism, and how do you tell people that think that anti-Zionism is, like, how do you explain the differences between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
Well, first of all, I want to say that Zionists have they've changed the definition of anti-Semitism to mean anti-Zionism, but it's a fluid thing, and with the Meghan McCain thing, we are seeing it change even more. Eventually, it's going to be anti-Semitism means anti-Christian Zionists, and then eventually it's going to mean Jews who are critical of Christian Zionists. I'm not even kidding. I want to do a comic about that. That's the shifting definition. So, I mean, Zionism is both a political and a cultural movement. Politically, it's, you know, obviously establishing the state of Israel, and there are different forms of Zionism. I don't know how much you're into it, or you know about it. So, do you? I don't know.
A little bit.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
No, because I don't want to say something you already know, or
yeah, I know about like the liberal Zionism and
okay.
Like the idea of liberal Zionism and like Zionism as self-determination for the Jewish people broadly speaking. That does not necessarily have to be Israel, but there's also like Israel as a thing somewhere in there.
Right. So, I mean, there are so many different forms of Zionism. I think one aspect of contemporary Zionism, and also from the beginning, that has irked me, as I say in the presentation, is the sort of you know, the cultural and mystical idea that we cannot be a full people, both individually and collectively, outside of Israel. Okay. That's something I reject entirely. And in fact, when I say I'm non-Zionist, what I mean is, so I don't consider myself anti-Zionist, because it's like saying you're atheist. You're like anti, you know, whatever. Non-Zionist just means it doesn't really inform my Jewish identity at all. Obviously, it does, but you know. Yes.
I've been really enjoying watching a bunch of Jews basically come to your defense all over social media.
Okay. Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
Quickly. I've been very gratified by that too, but it also just really, really discourages me, the fact that all those Jews who have been coming to my defense are erased by the communal leadership and by the Jewish right, who have been demonizing me so much, and also demonizing all people who say this is a legitimate avenue towards Jewish self-expression or Jewish expression. But go on.
Well, that might have answered my question, but I was just wondering how you understand that sort of like emergence, or your place in the...
That? The fact that there are
like
people
how do you
who don't...
understand why they... Why
it's been very gratifying. Oh, wait, say the last part? Sorry?
How do you understand why they find you so inspiring?
I'm not sure what, I was going to say something. This is why I like try and get it out quick, because then, you know, the senility hits in. It's been gratifying. I don't remember what I was going to say, I'm sorry. This is where I totally, you know, go in the caffeine crescendo, and now it's just like, people are like, well, what is a Jew? I'm like, fuck. I come back to it. Generally, it's been very inspiring and good. Yeah. And maybe a new topic or new, yeah.
I don't know if you want to go there, but I was going to ask you a little bit about the Forward newspaper and...
What about them?
Oh, well, the opinion editor has been, very... Do you not want to go there?
I mean, I'd rather not say it on a video. Is that thing still rolling?
Yeah, I can turn it off.
No, you can keep it on.
Okay, let me make it more broad.
Okay.
It's more about, like, that sector of American Jews who actually are quite progressive and have not been the pro-Israel types that you criticize. Where are they in this formula, and do you see the shifts happening there? And there are certain Jews who I was surprised, who are very progressive, who went totally against Ilhan Omar, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, what do you think is going on in their minds? And you mentioned in your something about, like, they're being caught off guard, they're not realizing it. Like, what did you mean when you said that? And
in the presentation?
you mentioned it at some point about some American Jews have, like, you said both that, like, some of them have created and cultivated this atmosphere by supporting Israeli policies blindly, but also that they're being caught off guard in some way. So I'm not sure what you meant by that, and I'm wondering.
I thought when I mentioned that, I was saying that I was caught off guard by the if I'm understanding correctly, by forces that are allied with the most horrid expressions of political power in the past 100 years, calling me an anti-Semite. The Ilhan Omar thing is in terms of, like, supposedly progressive Jews going after her is really? Oh, good. Okay. Is sorry, I thought it was like a small. I'm like, oh, they were big. Why is that? Okay, now. Yeah, I mean, honestly, there are a lot of. I mean, the Ilhan Omar thing is. Yeah, I mean, we have to say there's a lot of racism and Islamophobia behind it because, I mean, I did one comic which these assholes have been saying, of course, is anti-Semitic, in which she's, the Ilhan we'd accept, in which she's saying these horrible things about Jews. And on the second speech balloon is saying, which is like, the Jews are a cursed, money-grubbing, disgusting, repulsive race. And then the bottom, who were given the whole land of Israel by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, hallelujah. But not just that, I mean, there have been even, like, critics of Israel who were not black and not Muslim, who did not get a tiny fraction of the response. And so, yeah, being Muslim, being black, and being a woman is unfortunately not in her favor when it comes to dealing with these things. And now I want the alt-right shitheads to clip out, is not in her favor, and I'm a racist and an Islamophobe. I'm sorry if that wasn't the most thought out answer. Yes?
How do you grapple with your outspokenness? I mean, I can imagine you've experienced so much slander over the past 10 years, and I'm sure you weren't always how you are now, in terms of your grit and your perseverance. So how has that, like, journey changed for you? Like, maybe you weren't always so shielded from criticism with your, like, witty remarks.
No, my personality, I think, has been the same. Yeah, I mean, the last week was not, honestly, I mean, I'm glad I can get, through this. I was getting a little emotional at the end. I don't know if you noticed. I didn't even expect that. I was concerned that there would be, like, people trying to disrupt it or all that kind of thing, and it would take me off. And also, the whole idea of gaslighting is making you believe, it's one of the ideas, is making you believe these falsehoods about reality, but also about yourself, And so it was making me self-conscious about certain aspects of my presentation, which is one of the reasons I'm joking about them being able to clip it out and use it against me. And so when it forces you to self-doubt, not in a good way, because self-doubt, of course, is essential, but self-doubt based on malicious, bad faith smears, then it's hazardous, That doesn't really answer your question. How do I deal, like, with the change? I mean, because the new change is actually a new thing, Maybe it's because I agreed to do it with SJP, who are considered, so, I don't know. I mean, guilt by association kind of thing, even though it shouldn't, that's ridiculous. And also, I'm not demeaning them at all. I'm not saying that they are, bad or worthy of this ridiculous abuse. And let's be honest, repulsive demonization shit. Yes?
A couple days ago, I woke up and on my way to the bathroom, I had the misfortune of walking past a poster for a Stanford College Republicans event called Yes, America is a Judeo-Christian nation.
Yeah, I talked about that. Yeah, I
It
mentioned
was within a man that, and I may be wrong about this,
Jews for Jesus.
bullshit, is a leader of George Bush's great friends, Jews for Jesus.
And apparently it works for the Daily Wire.
Oh, Jesus.
I'm not kidding. I think
Everything goes back to Ben Shapiro.
So what's your question?
Now, I'm sure you have some thoughts about the word Judeo-Christian. What would you like to treat the audience?
I mean, it's a bullshit term. It's a term used partly to erase Jews, and like, obviously it's the hegemonic culture, but it's also a term to sort of like have a backdoor entrance into Islamophobia. You know, Judeo-Christian meaning fuck the Muslims, right? I mean, the way it's used now today. That's what it means. That's all it is. And it shouldn't be used. I mean, people can use whatever they want, but we shouldn't take them seriously when they use that term. You know? And also, it erases Jews implicitly.
On the topic of Jewish erasure, how do you feel about the representation of Jewish people by the SCR being a Jew for Jesus?
Wait, the representation? Yeah, it's perfect, you know? I mean, it's an alt-right group, it seems to me. It's an anti-Semitic hate group, it seems to me. They should not have been able to do what they did without serious repercussions. I am appalled that the Stanford University administration didn't throw them off campus or at least institute some serious penalties for them distributing Nazi materials in dorms and pretending that Jewish tote bags are Nazis. And again, it's like they see Jews, it's repulsive to them. So they immediately, their first step is going to your stern. It's true. Yeah. Yes.
I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about your choice to go into comics as a mode of expression, how your own comic style developed, and I'm wondering if part of what you're seeing culturally is an illiteracy about that aspect of
Yes,
Jewish
a
culture.
lot of it is. You know Alex Perrine on Twitter, and he said something really so, yeah, you know what I'm talking about? He said it so succinct and it's like it was something that I've been, it was just really well said. Of course, I can't remember it now. Well, no, basically, people who leap immediately to Der Stürmer looking at my art have such a vast stupidity. This is not the way he said it, but similarly, vast stupidity about comic art and about Jewish comic art especially. I mean, even like back to the Weimar Republic kind of anti-fascist art from back then. That they have no right to be talking about culture at all. How can you call? I mean, I showed you Starchy from Mad. I mean, my stuff and Basil Wolverton. These shitheads couldn't even figure out what the hell that means. Basil Wolverton. He was a great Mad artist of the '50s who was drawing these grotesqueries, people with nostrils that are like this, and like warts all over themselves. I mean, it's such malicious, transparently bad faith attempt to silence somebody. Everyone has the right to do what they want. The fact that one of those people works the New York Times on their fucking op-ed page is a shanda, and that means disgrace. Yeah.
So, I used to be part of BBIO, which people will know is like a Zionist hellhole pipeline in Israel.
Jewish youth group.
Yeah. And I've been grappling with seeing a lot of my friends' younger siblings being propagandized by BBIO and their organizations. And it's made me wonder, as a leftist, do I have any obligation to engage with these young Jews that are being radicalized in the wrong way? And I'm wondering, do you feel any of that obligation in the work that you're doing? Do you view it as educational at all? And how do you grapple that when they're violently aggressive towards you, but yet you want to correct it?
Wait, I didn't get that part. They're actually violently aggressive towards you?
Not, well, they can be.
That's bad. You want relatives?
Well, I mean just in a broad sense.
Okay. No, I just want to know. It's disturbing. I mean, everything else you said, totally, first of all, Diaspora Boys should be mandatory reading in all Jewish day schools. Not too young, but starting at least 7th grade, I love it when people tell me their kids, love my work. That's actually very gratifying. Like I showed you, the kids in the comics, it's like the future. I'm trying to sell it. But the other thing is, I have a cousin who has kids who go to Zionist summer camps, and she's not that active. They just go there because they have friends or whatever, and she's like really disturbed, and they want to go to Israel in a gap year with these friends in these movements, which are not going to be giving them the full picture of what's going on over there, or the full picture of reality, and she's really disturbed by it. She doesn't know what to do, and so she's not very political, but she kind of gets my work, and so she's trying to inculcate them a little bit with my stuff, to try and deprogram them. But I mean, every year they get older, if they do not hear other points of view, the programming becomes more solidified, and it becomes more difficult to change it, to deprogram essentially. It's screwed up. But I was saying before, like I can't like say how to engage. That you should engage, for instance, relatives that are extremists. But I do think when it's younger people, I think we have more of an obligation because their minds, they're obviously they're being formed, and their experiences and their politics are being shaped. And if they're being shaped by rancid forces, we have to do what we can to counter it. Unfortunately, as we see the Hoover Institution at Stanford, the right wing has greater resources, and right-wing oligarchs seem to be more, it's in their self-interest to be putting money in institutions that perpetuate their own ideology. Yes?
I feel it'd be topical, because you're a beautiful sunny Silicon Valley, California, to talk about how sort of the libertarian liberalism of the place that I was told to be a great school is kind of very concerningly pro-Zionist. Kind of like I hear people talking about how, yeah, it'd be great to work up at a startup in Tel Aviv, or something to that extent. What do you think? Just take off.
Can you give it to me in a shorter, because I'm not sure, like that was a long...
Basically, what do you think about like Silicon Valley liberalism's hand to play in promoting
I'm not that familiar with that side of things. I do know that Israel, fashioned itself as a startup nation. And but I mean, I don't think it's good. I don't know, I don't have a good answer to that, I'm sorry. It's unfortunate, that, it's like their immediate, association of that. Yes, hi. Yes, you.
Okay. I was just wondering, I think you said like you and your sister doesn't totally get all your comics.
Sister, yes.
And some of the, like, seems like there's a lot of details, and even like I'm not totally like familiar with Jewish culture to the extent that I understand everything.
Right.
Does anyone kind of go through and like explain your comics anymore?
Again, I'm not trying to sell this book, but one of the only reason I brought this, or actually just give to whoever wants it here, SJP or KVP, is the facing pages of most of these comics have extensive liner notes that explain the nuances and the references and the context. Like for instance, Codename Evangelator was the Israel on Campus Coalition. It's a group that spies on students. Have you seen there were reports in the Forward and ProPublica about this really dangerous organization? They took pieces of Codename Evangelator out of context, right? Oh, they took it out, so I don't have it. It's here. It's over there. Yeah, so you can see that it's like, it's like 400 words or so. They took out one panel and say, I'm drawing Jews as reptiles. It was just disgusting, And so people of bad faith and deliberately isolating things, which is one of the reasons I was joking about it, can mischaracterize things, unfortunately. But in general, if you don't get all the nuances, like even this, when you're talking about Judeo-Christian, I have Ben Shapiro saying, after all, Judeo-Egyptian values built our world. Maybe in 4 years, you'll be like, well, I don't really understand why that. Like right now, we know because he's been talking about it, he's sending his Jews for Jesus to talk about it. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So can we do like one or two more questions, and then we'll transition into the second half and walk around.
I just want to say this is one of the best events I've ever been to on like anything related to these topics.
Thank you.
And one of the things I appreciated is renaming that like Judaism historically has been opposed to empire.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could spell out more what does empire mean in the context of the U.S. or Israel, and why is it all of our responsibility to oppose it?
Okay, I will say, I was hoping you were going to say, talk to me about the Haggadah and the ways that I'm not in college now, so I'm not like a grad student, so I can't talk about post-structuralist shit. So I'm not an expert on that stuff, so empire is bad in general. I'm trying to think. Israel is in many ways a tool of American empire, and that's one of the reasons that, like, it is anti-Semitic to say that Israel is controlling the world as its own empire. And so to understand it more in a larger sense of the power dynamics, clearly, that Israel is an extension of American agenda in the Middle East. I mean, from the American perspective, obviously there are other things too. There's the evangelical, whatever you want to call it, and so there are many dynamics, but through the filter only of empire, then yes. But if I can talk about the Haggadah, I mean, the whole foundation story of Judaism is anti-empire. Not just in that, but I mean, Purim with Persia. I'm trying to think. I mean, basically every Jewish narrative, in terms of the formation, the foundation stones of our people, in the broadest collective sense, is inspirational from the perspective of fighting constricting power structures, and that's one of the reasons it's so shameful. Not only that, certain Jews in the community are insisting that that are using Judaism as a cover for like some horrible shit, in terms of like pro-empire, but also that they are erasing the voice and the actual narrative tradition of, people like us, if I can say that. Our interpretation, of course I'm going to say it's more valid than theirs, but I mean, even if you're not going to say it's more valid, I mean, they're saying that we are anti-Semites. They're erasing us as Jews. They're I mean, it's been, that's one of the reasons the Meghan McCain thing is just so emblematic of what's going on. They would prefer, I mean, when the Meghan McCain thing was happening with me, there were right-wing Jews who were saying, come over to Shabbat dinner, you are one of us, you're one of us, and in the same breath saying that I'm an anti-Semite. I mean, it's not a metaphor saying they're erasing us. They are erasing us.
So I know your art is like primarily focused on the Jewish community and like speaking to other Jews, but like what do you think is an appropriate way for me as someone who is raised a Muslim American to engage with your work in a respectful way and like be a part of like a Jewish Muslim solidarity community for rights in Palestine?
With my work in particular?
Yeah, that, and then also in general, just like is there a role for Muslim Americans in the Jewish American community for Palestinian rights?
Absolutely, there must be, yes. Unfortunately, I'm not an organizer on the ground, so I can't really give you like tips like in terms of that kind of thing. But yes, I mean there has to be mutual support and uplifting and all that kind of thing. In terms of my comics themselves, I'm not sure I quite understood like what you meant in terms of how to approach them.
Would you say it's appropriate for me to share it on Facebook, and say, would you think
share my comics?
Would you think it's appropriate to share your comics with like literal Jewish friends of mine?
Oh, okay. Yeah,
as a Muslim.
Yeah, that can be problematic. I don't think it should be problematic, but I don't know who your friends are or what the contexts are. But yes, just as some people in the Jewish community are getting shit from right-wing Jews for sharing my comics, certainly I can't deny that you might get shit as well. So yeah, I know. I imagine I try and put myself into the situation if it was like another cultural community or religious community and me sharing it, people might, they might think just like David Duke, spokesperson, was talking about, if it's shared by a certain, you might get shit for that or whatever. So I guess it's a nuanced thing you need to, analyze on a case-by-case basis, but also, I mean, I don't know your community, I don't know who your Facebook friends are, what kind of people they are, If they're friends of yours who also like my comics, then I think it's fine, But yeah, is that okay?
Yeah.
Any more?
So I think we're going to wrap up the Q&A now, and so just like to thank Eli again for the lecture.
Thank you. thanks for having me, and thanks for the horror show this past week, which is not your fault, but it's been elucidating in some ways.
And so as we as mentioned earlier, we've got some of this art around the walls.